China beats SpaceX in the Methalox race to orbit, India heads for the moon, and this Falcon Heavy launched satellite is in big trouble. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF. It's Friday the 14th of July, and there's much more to come this week in Spaceflight. This week, we saw NASA adding more spacesuit contracts for its International Space Station program and the Artemis program. Last September, NASA announced the winner of the contract to supply spacesuits for astronauts to use while on the surface of the moon. Of the two contenders, Axiom Space and Collins Aerospace, Axiom was the winner of the contract. Just 3 months after that, NASA announced Collins Aerospace would be selected to build spacesuits for the ISS, replacing the existing ones used for extravehicular activities. Now, in a sort of switcheroo, NASA has added a contract for Axiom to work on spacesuits for ISS spacewalks and another contract for Collins to work on spacesuits for use on the surface of the moon. According to NASA, this change will allow the agency to, quote, enhance redundancy, expand future capabilities, and further invest in the space economy. With this new contract, it appears that NASA wants to ensure it gets the spacesuits it needs one way or another. Viasat's latest satellite is not working as it should, meaning the company has arrived at a big roadblock. The company announced that its Viasat 3 America satellite has suffered an anomaly during the deployment of its big foldable reflector antenna. Now, this is the one that launched just 2 months ago on the first fully expendable Falcon Heavy rocket, along with 2 other satellites. And by the way, if you want that specific Falcon Heavy on your wall, it's your last chance to grab it from shop.nasaspaceflight.com. This antenna is mounted on the satellite at the end of a retractable boom that's about 30 meters long. Without it, the satellite is unable to provide its up to 1 terabyte speed connectivity that Viasat had promised. This could lead to the total loss of the satellite, something that could trigger a $420 million insurance claim as part of the loss. This would be a record insurance claim for the commercial satellite market. Viasat is already suffering the consequences of this news as it plummets in the stock market by almost 30%. It certainly seems that not only the satellite, but also the company might be in big trouble. ULA CEO Tory Bruno took to the phone on Thursday to spell out the fate of Vulcan, and this came just a few days after news of an engine explosion on the test stand. One of the BE-4 engines slated for Vulcan's second flight had exploded on the test stand just 10 seconds into an acceptance test. Tory Bruno quickly said on Twitter that the incident would have little to no effect on the first flight of Vulcan. He also said that the failure encountered had no commonalities with the engines that were already slated to fly on that first mission. He claimed that the reason for the engine failure was, quote, workmanship failure. Normally, the test stand systems can automatically shut down the engine if they sense some parameters are going off their limits. However, Tory said that in this case, the engine failed just below one of the limits, and the stand wasn't able to shut it down before the engine failed. These limits will now be tweaked to take into account this potential failure mode, which should not be present on a healthy engine. On that same call, he announced that the first flight of Vulcan would now be no earlier than the last quarter of 2023. ULA is now in the process of reinforcing the top dome of the Centaur 5 upper stage for not only the first flight, but also all subsequent Vulcan missions. It sounds quite ambitious, but you can bet we're going to keep our eye on whether that schedule is met or not. Every time we get to see a test, we'll be turning our Space Coast Live cameras to Slick 41. Now let's go over this week in launches. This Falcon 9 lifted off on July 7th at 1929 UTC from Space Launch Complex 4 East in California. It carried a batch of Starlink V1.5 satellites in support of Starlink's second-generation constellation. The first stage, B-1063, was flying for a 12th time, and it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship Of Course I Still Love You. A Changzheng 2C rocket lifted off on July 9th at 11 o'clock UTC from the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center in China. The rocket carried a pair of test satellites into a polar orbit. It is believed that these test satellites are likely part of China's state-owned LEO communications satellite constellation, SatNet. Another Falcon 9 launched on July 10th at 3:58 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. This rocket carried a batch of Starlink V2 mini satellites in support of Starlink's second-generation constellation. The booster for this mission was B-1058, and it was flying a record 16th time, the first time a Falcon 9 booster has flown this many times. This booster was taken out of the fleet for 7 months as SpaceX recertified booster reuse for up to 20 flights. Of course, as you can imagine, a recovery was attempted, and it successfully landed on the drone ship. Just read the instructions. Now, if you remember, this booster was the one that supported SpaceX's first human spaceflight mission back in 2020. So it seems like the NASA worm logo on its side will keep on going for just a few more flights. Of course, the biggest launch this week was the successful launch of LandSpace's Zhuge 2 Methalox rocket. The rocket lifted off on July 12th at 1 o'clock UTC from Site 96 at the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center in China. It carried a test payload into a sun-synchronous orbit. Its first flight last December ended in failure due to an anomaly during second-stage flight that did not allow the rocket to reach orbit. However, this time, the rocket finally got all the way there and did successfully reach orbit. So this makes it the first methane-fueled rocket to do so. The other contenders in the quote-unquote Methalox race were SpaceX's Starship and ULA's Vulcan rocket. An early contender, Relativity's Terran 1, was in the race as well, but after its first failed flight, the company decided to focus on its larger Terran R rocket, which now won't debut until at least 2026. However, unlike Starship or Vulcan, Zhuge 2 is a much smaller rocket, only able to lift 4 tons to sun-synchronous orbit. But LandSpace has big plans ahead to create larger and more powerful rockets, so hey, we'll be here if that happens. Methalox is the new cool fuel that everyone seems to be working with, and a big congrats to LandSpace for being the first company to fully harness its power. Well, maybe this tops the list of this week's launches: India's most important flight of the year. Liftoff of the launch vehicle Mark III rocket took place on July 14th at 9:05 UTC from the Satish Dhawan Space Center in India. It carried the Chandrayaan-3 spacecraft, India's second attempt at landing a probe on the moon. The rocket successfully placed the spacecraft into a highly elliptical orbit around the Earth. Chandrayaan-3's propulsion module will raise this orbit to intercept the moon in the coming days and weeks. During orbit raising, the spacecraft systems will be checked out, and it is expected to arrive at the moon in early August. Here, it'll be checked out again while it performs several orbit-lowering maneuvers to prepare for its landing in late August. The spacecraft consists of 3 parts: a propulsion module, the lander itself, and a rover that is also riding aboard. Prior to the landing, the propulsion module will separate and the lander will start its descent to the surface. While ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, didn't fully release the cause of the failure of Chandrayaan-2, it claims to have solved all of the issues that prompted that failure. So if all goes well on landing day, India could become the 4th country to soft land a spacecraft on the moon, joining the United States, Soviet Union, and China. So come back in a few weeks and we might be celebrating with you, India. Now let's take a quick glimpse at some other stories across space. In more Indian space news, this week Voyager Space announced that it had signed a Memorandum of Understanding with ISRO. This is to transport crew to Voyager's Starlab space station. This would definitely be a boost for both organizations, with Starlab potentially gaining an important foreign government partner, while ISRO expands its human spaceflight program to also visit commercial space stations. Artemis astronauts will get to ride on SLS, but before that, they'll need a ride to the pad. This week, NASA received the 3 vans made by automotive company Canoo that will be used to transport Artemis astronauts out to their launch pad. These cars are called Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, in reference to the 3 programs that helped NASA go to the moon back in the 1960s. So, what do you think of Canoo's vehicle? NASA's Janus spacecraft will not get to fly for the foreseeable future. Janus was originally planned to launch in August of 2022 as a rideshare on the Psyche mission. However, due to delays on Psyche's readiness, the flight was postponed to October of 2023, but this launch window is no longer suitable for the Janus mission. This, coupled with dwindling science budgets, prompted the agency to decide to keep the 2 spacecraft for the mission in storage. This would last at least until a launch window and funding could be made available. And now, let's go over next week in spaceflight. An Electron rocket is set to launch this week, carrying 6 satellites for various customers, including NASA. The mission, called Baby Come Back, is planned to occur within a 2-hour launch window that opens on July 16th at 23:30 UTC. The mission will feature another recovery attempt of the rocket's first stage out from the ocean. A Falcon 9 rocket is set to launch next week, carrying a batch of Starlink V2 mini satellites. Liftoff is planned to occur from Vandenberg within a 6-hour, 14-minute window that opens on July 19th at 2:29 UTC. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. We'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.